There's a moment almost everyone recognizes instantly. You know exactly what you should do. The workout, the hard conversation, the unfinished project sitting untouched for weeks. And in that exact moment, before you've even consciously decided anything, a reason arrives. Reasonable sounding, almost persuasive, for why not today. Here's what should unsettle you about that moment. It happens so fast and feels so justified that most people never even notice it as a choice. It just feels like circumstance, like bad timing, like something outside their control.
Think about how differently you'd assess someone else making that same excuse. If a friend told you they couldn't exercise because they were too tired today, you'd probably think nothing of it. But if that same excuse repeated for the 300th day in a row, at some point it would stop sounding like circumstance and start sounding like a pattern. We rarely apply that same honest scrutiny to our own repeated excuses, precisely because we're too close to notice the repetition. Brian Tracy spent decades studying the single trait that separates people who achieve what they set out to do from people who spend years circling the same stalled goals. His conclusion wasn't intelligence, talent, luck, or even opportunity. It was something far less glamorous and far more available to absolutely everyone, regardless of where they started.
Self-discipline. Not as a personality trait some people are simply born with, but as a skill, built the same way any other skill is built, through specific, repeatable practice applied directly against the exact excuses that have been running your life on autopilot for years. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to recognize your own most used excuse instantly and understand exactly why it's kept working on you for so long. Most of us think of discipline as something you either have or don't, an internal reserve of willpower that some fortunate people were simply born with more of. Under this belief, if you keep failing to follow through, the conclusion feels obvious. You must just be one of the people without much of it. Tracy directly challenges this. Self-discipline, in his framework, isn't a fixed trait. It's closer to a muscle, strengthened through consistent use and weakened through consistent avoidance. Meaning every single time you give in to an excuse, you're not just missing one action. You're actively training the excuse-making part of your brain to be stronger and more convincing the next time. This reframes the entire problem. It's not that undisciplined people lack some ingredient disciplined people have plenty of. It's that undisciplined people have, often unknowingly, spent years practicing surrender instead of practicing follow-through. And the results of that practice look exactly like a character trait, even though it was built action by action, the same way the opposite trait gets built in someone else.
This is the real problem the book solves. Not how do I finally get enough willpower, but how do I stop unconsciously practicing the wrong skill every single day and start deliberately practicing the one I actually want? If you've ever told yourself, I'm just not a disciplined person, that wasn't a diagnosis. According to this book, that was simply an accurate description of your practice history so far, which means it's also entirely capable of changing. Tracy identifies a specific mental habit responsible for the vast majority of unfinished goals, one he calls the path of least resistance. Given any choice between an easy option and a hard one, human beings default toward whichever requires less immediate effort, almost automatically, unless a specific counter habit has been deliberately trained.
This explains something that puzzles most people about their own behavior. You genuinely want the outcome, the fit body, the finished business plan, the paid-off debt. But wanting the outcome and choosing the harder daily action required to reach it are, according to Tracy, two entirely separate mental processes. And the second one loses to the path of least resistance constantly, unless something interrupts the pattern directly. The book's counter to this isn't more motivation, which Tracy treats as an unreliable ally at best, here today, gone by Wednesday. It's a specific technique he calls the discipline of preparation. Deciding in advance, calmly and without the emotional pressure of the actual moment, exactly what action you'll take when the resistance shows up. the workout clothes laid out the night before, the first sentence of the hard email drafted ahead of time. Removing as many small decisions as possible from the moment resistance is strongest. This works, Tracy argues, because willpower is a limited resource that depletes throughout the day. But a decision made calmly in advance doesn't require willpower to execute later. It just requires following through on a plan that's already settled. Tracy points out a related, often overlooked factor here: environment design. Most people try to fight the path of least resistance through sheer force of will, in the moment, when resistance is at its absolute peak. A far more reliable approach, according to the book, is arranging your physical environment so the discipline choice becomes the easier one by default. Keep the junk food out of the house entirely, and willpower is never required at 9 p.m. Put the guitar in the middle of the living room instead of in a closet, and practicing becomes the path of least resistance instead of the one requiring effort to access. Here's where Tracy gets specific about excuses themselves, cataloging the handful of justifications responsible for the overwhelming majority of abandoned goals. Not hundreds of unique excuses, but a small, repeating set, dressed up differently depending on the situation. I don't have enough time tops the list, and Tracy's response to it is characteristically blunt. Time isn't actually the scarce resource in most cases. Priority is. The book points out that the same person claiming no time for exercise will somehow find 2 hours for a show they enjoy that evening. The excuse isn't lying about feeling busy. It's mislabeling a choice about priorities as an unavoidable constraint about time. I don't have enough money is next, and Tracy's counter here is that resourcefulness, historically, has mattered more than resources. He points to the long list of people who built significant success, starting from genuine financial disadvantage, arguing that lack of capital forces a different kind of problem solving, that abundant capital often makes lazy and unnecessary. It's not the right time might be the most seductive excuse of all, because it sounds patient and wise rather than avoidant. Tracy's response is direct. There will never be a perfect, risk-free, obviously correct moment to start anything meaningful. Waiting for that moment isn't patience. It's indefinite postponement wearing patience as a disguise. I'm too tired rounds out the most common category, and Tracy's counter here is one of his sharper observations. Genuine physical exhaustion is real and worth respecting, but the fatigue that shows up specifically and reliably at the exact moment a difficult task needs doing, and mysteriously lifts the moment something enjoyable is proposed instead, isn't physical tiredness at all. It's resistance, wearing the language of tiredness because tiredness is a harder excuse to argue with. There's a specific concept Tracy returns to constantly throughout the book, one borrowed from behavioral psychology and applied ruthlessly to goal setting: the 21-day habit formation window, and more importantly, what happens in the first few days inside it. The early days of any new discipline, according to Tracy, are disproportionately difficult, not because the task itself is hard, but because you're actively fighting against years of established neural pathways built around the old, easier behavior. Most people interpret this early difficulty as proof the new habit isn't working or isn't for them, and quit right at the exact point where the resistance was always going to be highest. Tracy's counter-argument is almost mechanical in its simplicity. The difficulty of the first several days isn't a signal to stop. It's the expected temporary cost of habit formation, and it reliably decreases with each consecutive day the behavior is repeated. Meaning the people who succeed aren't the ones who find it easy from day one. They're simply the ones who kept going through the specific window where quitting felt most justified. This is why the book insists on tracking consecutive days directly, treating an unbroken streak as more valuable in the early stages than the quality or intensity of any single day's effort. A mediocre but consistent effort repeated daily beats an excellent effort performed sporadically, because consistency is what actually rewires the underlying habit. One of the more demanding sections of the book addresses what Tracy calls comfort zone addiction. The specific, measurable discomfort that arises whenever someone attempts to change an established pattern, even when they consciously want to change. Tracy argues this discomfort isn't a sign something is wrong. It's a sign the change is actually happening. And it's specifically because most people misread this discomfort as evidence they've made a mistake that so many disciplined attempts collapse in the first week. The comfort zone in his framework functions almost like an addiction, not to any specific substance, but to the familiar, regardless of whether the familiar thing is actually good for you. The practical application here is reframing discomfort itself. Instead of treating the resistance you feel when skipping a habitual excuse as a red flag to retreat from, Tracy suggests treating it as direct evidence you're doing exactly the right thing. Since real change, by definition, always involves stepping outside a pattern the brain has grown comfortable defaulting to. There's a specific exercise Tracy calls the 30-day mental diet, borrowed loosely from earlier self-help literature and sharpened into something more actionable. A full month of deliberately refusing to voice, even internally, any negative or excuse-making thought without immediately countering it with a constructive one. The rule is strict on purpose. Catch a thought like, "I'll never have time for this," and it has to be immediately followed, out loud if possible, with something like, "I will make 10 minutes for this today." Tracy insists the discipline here isn't really about forced positivity. It's about interrupting the automatic nature of excuse generation specifically, since most excuses only work because they arrive unchallenged and unnoticed. Most people who attempt this, Tracy notes, are startled by how often they catch themselves mid-excuse within just the first few days. Not because they're unusually negative people, but because nobody had ever asked them to actually count how often the habit fires. The counting itself, independent of anything else, tends to reduce the frequency, simply by dragging an unconscious pattern into conscious view. Here's the deeper message underneath everything in this book. We've been taught that discipline is something certain fortunate people simply have, and the rest of us are stuck working around. Under that belief, every abandoned goal becomes further evidence of a fixed personal limitation, and eventually, most people stop even attempting things that require sustained follow-through, quietly protecting themselves from confirming once again that they're just not that kind of person. Tracy's argument dismantles this completely. Discipline was never a trait some people are handed at birth. It's the accumulated result of small, repeated choices at exactly the moments excuses show up. Moments that happen dozens of times a day, mostly unnoticed. Each one either reinforcing the old pattern or beginning to build a new one. So the uncomfortable truth is this. If you've spent years believing you simply lack the discipline other people seem to have, the actual explanation is almost certainly simpler and far more fixable. You've had more practice giving into the excuse than practice pushing through it. And practice, in either direction, compounds. The real question isn't, how do I finally become a disciplined person? It's, what is the very next excuse I'm about to make? And am I willing to catch it in the exact moment it shows up? That's the entire argument of this book. Not a personality upgrade, a skill built the same unglamorous way every other skill gets built, one repeated choice at a time. The people who accomplish the most rarely feel more motivated than everyone else. They've simply had more practice acting despite the absence of motivation at the exact moment the excuse first appears. No amount of inspiration is going to hand you discipline automatically. According to this book, it has to be built, one uncomfortable choice at a time, starting well before it ever feels easy. The question now isn't whether you have what it takes, it's whether you're willing to catch your next excuse in real time and act anyway, starting today. If this changed how you think about your own follow-through, subscribe for more breakdowns like this one, and drop a comment with the excuse you use most often. And if you want to see how this connects to making that first small action impossible to fail at, watch the video on screen now. It picks up exactly where this one leaves off.